So, good evening and a very warm welcome to everyone. My name is Jo Nove. I'm the Director of Strategy, Communications and Brand here at Myeloma UK, and thank you very much for joining us for this event, The Power of the Patient Voice, How Myeloma UK Works to Get New Treatments Approved on the NHS. Now, unfortunately, Sheila McKinley, our Director of Research and Advocacy, couldn't be here tonight, so I'm stepping in for her. She sends her apologies and she hopes to see you all very shortly. Now, there's a bit of housekeeping I need to take us all through at the start. The first is this event is being recorded and we'll send a link to the recording to everyone who registered for the event. The recording will be available in a few days once subtitles have been added. We do this for accessibility reasons, but you can, if you want, watch this event immediately afterwards on Facebook Live. We're going to have a Q&A section towards the end of the event. Please do use the Q&A function at the bottom of your page. We have received, as you would expect, lots of questions in advance. So we'll start with those first, but we will do our best to get through as many questions as we possibly can. However, unfortunately, we won't be able to provide any personal medical advice during this event, but you can call our info line or use our Ask the Nurse service, and the details for those should be appearing in the chat below now. If you have any comments or problems with your sound or images, let us know again in the chat function below, and we'll do our best to help you fix things. And after the event, we will be sending around a survey so you can feedback and let us know what other areas of our work you would like to hear more about it. Please do fill it in if you can. It's incredibly important to us to know what you are interested in. So this evening, we are going to be exploring what we mean when we say Myeloma UK advocates for patients to get access to new treatment. And we're going to shine a spotlight on this unique area of Myeloma UK's work that has had a huge impact for patients over the last 25 years. It's been a mainstay of what we give to the myeloma community. The charity was, in the first instance, built on this, and health technology assessments and getting new treatments into clinic is hugely important to us. We're going to hear from Dr. Scott Purdon from Myeloma UK, and he's going to talk to us a little bit about how treatments are approved and the role that Myeloma UK plays in this process. And then we're going to hear from two people directly involved in the process. We're going to hear from a patient, Rosie Dill, and we're going to hear from a clinician, Dr. Neil Rabin. And then, as I said earlier, we'll wind up within the hour, finishing with a question and answer session. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Scott Purdon, who is Myeloma UK's Head of Patient Advocacy. Scott, are you there? Wonderful, welcome. Scott has been involved in work around access to treatments for over 20 years. He has led joint working partnerships with patient organisations, government, the NHS and the pharmaceutical industry across the UK, in Europe and at a global level. He is new to the team at Myeloma UK, and we're absolutely delighted to have his expertise to draw on as we take this important area of work forward. So Scott, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jo, and good evening to everyone that's joining us. And yeah, it's an absolute pleasure to be alongside Rosie and Neil. I think, as you've described, we're increasingly asked about our contribution and our work and how we seek to get new drugs approved as quickly as possible in the NHS. And what we're going to do today is just give you an overview of what that looks like for us and how we work very closely with Rosie and people living with myeloma, and also with our clinical colleagues, such as Neil. And what I'll do, I'll try and walk through the process that we go through to get new drugs approved. And I'll also touch upon each of the different organisations and experts that are involved, and that includes organisations like the Scottish Medicines Consortium, NICE, the licensing agencies, and also the pharmaceutical industry. So I think this audience is very, very familiar with myeloma, and I think we all understand the nature of the disease and its impact on people living with myeloma, with carers and with families. And we've seen great developments through the new diagnostics and new treatments, and we've seen that people are living longer and quality of life has improved. However, we're also very mindful, and I'm sure Rosie and Neil will touch on this, of the relapse and the remitting nature of myeloma. And we know that as the disease progresses, the drugs that we have currently are effective up to a point, but we need new drugs. So we need new drugs with new modes of action that target myeloma in different ways. And we're aware, we want new drugs that have minimal side effects, more manageable side effects. We're looking for longer remission times, and we're looking for longer periods, gaps between the need to take treatments, and ultimately we're looking for a cure. And I think that's what everyone today has joined us to hear a bit more about. And I think what we also are encouraging is people on the call today. We're looking for people to join us, to share their experience, and also to support us in many different ways. So just a little bit. So I'm the head of patient advocacy, and I report into Sheila, and we work across we would say, all aspects of treatment of myeloma. That that ranges from policy to diagnostics to new treatments. So we get involved in clinical trials, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But really, it's just to say, at Myeloma UK, we touch and impact on every aspect of preventing myeloma, treating myeloma, and living well with myeloma. And what I want to do today is just to focus into that piece that's really critical, and that's about how new drugs, once they're developed and licensed, how they're accessible to patients on the NHS. And so for today, we're going to focus on that health technology assessment piece. But I think it's useful just to bear in mind or to see this as an overview. So as I've said, we work with many partners, including the pharmaceutical companies, academics, scientists, clinicians, people living with myeloma, right through the life cycle of how a new drug is developed and reaches patients in the clinic. And we don't really have time today, but maybe another time we'll go into more detail. But we keep abreast and we fund projects at the kind of biomedical research stage, looking at new molecular targets, new drugs that have different treatments. We work across the clinical trials area, and I think you're all familiar. Clinical trials assess the safety of a new drug at phase 1, normally in healthy volunteers, and then it progresses to looking at the safety and the efficacy of that drug in people living with myeloma, and also at different stages of the disease. So you'll hear things about indications and the drug being available for newly diagnosed or people on second line, third line, and then unfortunately refractory in disease progression. And there's some really positive new drugs that I'm going to talk a little bit about that are coming through, which we would say we're at fourth line and fifth line, a real critical unmet need. We don't go into the detail today of the licensing, but I think people will have heard of the European Medicines Agency or the MHRA. And so they look at the safety and efficacy of a drug that's been trialed in clinical trials, and they will give authorization or marketing authorization. For us in the UK and many other countries, there's another hurdle, which is called health technology assessment, and we'll go on and talk a bit more about that. And then Rosie and Neil are experts in this area, but once the drug's approved and NHS has it available, how does it get into the clinic? And that's everything from the capacity needs of the NHS, is how the drug is dosed. Is it intravenous? Is it infusion? Is it once a day, once a week? What are the imaging support mechanisms that are needed around that, and what the other types of support that are needed in the clinic? So today we're going to talk about this process called health technology assessment, and it can become quite technical, but effectively the NHS in their words and in the words of NICE, they have a restricted drug budget. So to put it in context, NHS has a drug budget of about £17 billion. And the NHS budget's anywhere upwards of £140 billion. And so the NHS has to be able to pay for drugs which it deems affordable. And to do that, it has to assess a number of drugs across different disease areas and for different indications and conditions. And it does this by taking advice from health technology appraisal organisations like NICE and like the Scottish Medicines Consortium. And again, these processes are very similar. There are some key differences, but effectively both of these organisations take the data from the pharmaceutical companies. They ask for insights from clinicians like Neil and from people living with myeloma like Rosie, and ourselves are there to try and amplify and to really get across the messages of the continuing unmet need, the impact on quality of life, and really to try and get these drugs approved as quickly as possible. And I'll go through that in a bit more detail in the next slide. So this is quite a complex slide, but I think some of the questions we are often asked around are, how do I get involved in the health technology appraisal process? What is Myeloma UK doing, and how can we have an impact? And as I've said, this is a graphic really of how both NICE and SMC operate to look at the cost effectiveness of a new drug. And it's a process, it's embedded in health economics, and it's a way that NICE can look at a drug, compare it to standard of care, to look at the efficacy, the safety, the benefits or the added benefits of the new drugs, but also look at that cost differential. So if a new drug has better efficacy and safety but costs more, there are a number of systems and methods in here that we can feed into to encourage the early adoption of that new drug. It's basically broken down the process into 4 distinct phases, and within each of those phases there's a number of other processes and engagement aspects. But just to keep it fairly straightforward today, when a new drug has a license and has shown good efficacy and safety, NICE and SMC will issue a request for our involvement and other stakeholders to get involved in the scoping phase. So it sets out myeloma disease, what current medications are available that we call standard of care. It looks at the impact on quality of life. It looks at the impact on disease progression, overall survival, very good partial response rates. It looks at the remission times, and really it's trying to build a body of evidence. And we do that, and we work closely with Neil and clinicians, and we work closely with Rosie and people living with myeloma, and we also work closely with the pharmaceutical industry. A key area for us is around evidence submission, and that's where we work with people that have used or been on the drug, and we look at what stage of myeloma disease that the drug is indicated for. So if they're newly diagnosed, if they're in remission, if they're on to their second line, third line or fourth line. And this is key. I think our main role is to, in a way, translate the impact of myeloma, but also the impact of the drug on well-being, on quality of life, including the impact on carers and on family and in the workplace. And so the whole piece there, this is where we try and drive our evidence through. Now, the decision makers, NICE and SMC, then go through what we would call committee meetings with experts. And that's where they look at what the impact of the drug is, what the unmet needs are, and they get into the technicalities of, is the drug good value for money, and does it have good effect and impact for people living with myeloma? So again, that's where we would normally attend these meetings with someone with lived experience like Rosie, and we would attend with clinicians. Now, at this stage, the NICE or SMC will make a decision on whether to make that drug available to the NHS. And it is a bit more, there's more detail in that, because the NHS can still say that the drug's not affordable, even though it's cost effective. So it's shown good value, good safety, but it's not affordable. And then that's where we get into decisions whether to fully recommend and reimburse it, so to commission it. We can also get into a situation which I'm sure Neil and perhaps Rosie can talk on, that the drug shows good effect, but there's some uncertainty about the long-term impact of the drug. And we can get into a thing called managed access and the Cancer Drugs Fund, for example. And so that drug will be made available to patients for a period of 2 years, and we will generate more data to see how good the drug is working. And what I should say, there is an opportunity to appeal negative decisions. So that's where NICE says that the drug's not cost effective and patients can't have access to the drug. Unfortunately, we've had to appeal 2 of those decisions this year. But it shows the power of the patient voice, that both of those appeals were upheld, which effectively means NICE have to go back and look at the data again and look at the evidence and look at the impact. And over the next month or 2, we'll see the outcome of those appeals. And once the guidance is published, that's where we get into the end of that previous slide around how do patients and how do clinicians, how are they able to prescribe the drug? And again, just to reiterate, I think Joe touched on it at the beginning, the impact we've had over the last 25 years with your support has been quite phenomenal, to the point where we have 9 new drugs approved on the NHS in over 13 different combinations. And again, this audience doesn't need a reminder, life expectancy has quadrupled. I think 3 out of 10 patients living 10 years or longer, but also the needs are still there. We have a real need for drugs that can treat refractory or resistant myeloma. We need drugs that have better safety profiles. We need drugs that perhaps the dosing interval is less frequent, and we need drugs with longer lasting effect and impact. And really, we're looking towards cure. So at the minute, to give you a bit of a flavour, there are very, very promising new drugs that are undergoing assessment at the minute. And I think the take-home message here is a lot of these are at the critical unmet need stage for our community. They're at 4th line and beyond. And they have several of them have different mechanisms of action, drug body conjugates, where you have the antibody and you have the drug itself that's cytotoxic to the myeloma cell. We have bispecific antibodies, and I think, without going into the detail, and I'll share some signposts where we can find more detail on this, these drugs have the ability to transform the quality of life and response rates in a very much needed area. And so at the minute, we are engaging with NICE, we're engaging with SMC. We talk frequently with people who have been on these drugs in clinical trials, and it's a very dynamic area. I think we're in discussion with something like 14 pharmaceutical companies at any one time, and really this is to get across the breadth of what we're doing, but also the impact. And again, I encourage, and we'll do it then, that more people to become involved. And so as we go forward, I think the success of new treatments does add a complexity to the health technology appraisal process. Because we are improving quality of life and life expectancy, the bar becomes almost higher for the new drugs coming through, particularly against cost compared against standard of care. We do need more treatments, particularly refractory and later stages of disease. We need better tolerated drugs. We need new modes of action. And also, we're looking at, can we have a system that is flexible? And maybe Neil will touch on this, and Rosie, that's flexible to individuals. So can we start to treat based on a person's health status, on their disease status, on what the best drugs to treat them would be? At the minute, the system is very rigid. Where, as I said, you go through first line, second line, third line, fourth line, and you're pretty much tied to that almost treatment pathway or treatment algorithm. And we're really doing work now and early into next year and the year beyond to try and advocate and to implement diagnostics for high-risk myeloma, but also more flexibility in clinician prescribing. And what I'm encouraging today is for more people to get involved. Everyone that's on the call today, you can register directly with NICE. What I would like to say is the public involvement teams at NICE and SMC are incredibly supportive. We talk with them regularly. They're always giving us advice on some of the technical elements of what I've described, but also they're great at preparing for the committee meetings and for the scoping and evidence submissions. And so you can apply to be a member of those public engagement panels. Also, if you get in touch with ourselves, we'd be delighted to hear from you, and we can go into a bit more detail on this process and how we work. And again, a key piece of what we do and our information and our insights and our partnerships is with the Advocacy Partner Panel. And next year we'll be looking to expand that. I think didn't really touch on, but a big piece that we're looking at is health inequalities and disparities, whether it's geography, ethnicity, or gender. And we're looking to broaden our experience in that area. So if you are interested, we've got the email there, volunteering@myeloma.org.uk, and it'd be great to hear from you. And then just finally, we've got some great resources at Myeloma UK, and I'm sure you're familiar with some of these. But if you go into the Myeloma Trial Finder, that will allow you to look at new clinical trials at phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. It'll allow you to filter by where you are in your disease journey, and it's a great tool that you can then talk with ourselves, or perhaps talk with your consultant hematologist or with your clinical nurse specialist. The myeloma drug tracker is also a great tool for looking at what's coming through in the pipeline. And again, what we use readily, and what I would encourage everyone to look at, is the information library that goes through each of the drugs in detail. It talks about the mechanism of action, the safety profile, the efficacy, and the data sources. So altogether, these are a great tool for you to become more familiar with what's coming and what's currently available.
Scott, thank you so much for that. I think a lot of us are very familiar with the huge achievements and step forwards we've made in terms of treatment since the charity began, but that really enforced that there's a whole new phase of challenges out there, isn't there, that we need to be prepared to meet.
Yeah, and I think there's that combination. We've had great success, but there's so much more that we need to do. And I think part of that is, as I use this word or this phrase, translating patient or people living with myeloma's experience into the technical language that health technology appraisal systems use. And that's our power. That's where we make a difference. And NICE and SMC acknowledge that it's critical that we continue to do that and they encourage us to do that. And that's why we work so closely with Neil and Rosie to make sure that that unmet need is always heard.
That's fantastic, Scott. Now, we're going to say goodbye to you very briefly now, but you're going to come back for the Q&A session. And I now have the privilege to introduce to you some people who have been directly involved in the process for getting new treatments approved. And the first person I'm going to introduce you to is Rosie Dill, who is a member of our Advocacy Partner Panel, which she's going to tell us a bit about. But before we talk about the amazing work that Rosie does for us, Rosie, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Joe, is that you freezing or me?
Oh, I think it was probably a combination of both of us, but we seem to be working well now. Did you hear?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was
Yeah,
just
no,
going to ask Rosie to tell me a little bit about yourself.
hi everyone. Some of you will know me because I know a few people have tuned in from Bath. Hi, I'm Rosie Dill. I have myeloma. I was diagnosed with a plasmacytoma in 2012, which seems a long time ago now. I was only 45. I just woke up one day with double vision, and it turned out I had a lesion pressing on an optic nerve at my brainstem, so it was all a bit of a shock. My children were still at primary school, so they were really small. I think they were maybe 6 and 9 years old. And I went on to develop myeloma shortly after being treated for that plasmacytoma. And I've had 2 stem cell transplants and 2 other treatments. DVD, which is daratumumab vedotin dex, and IRD, which is ixazomib, Revlimid and dex, although many of you will know Revlimid is lenalidomide, I think. And interesting in the context of this, those treatments were newly approved treatments subsequent to me being diagnosed. So I'm testament to what a difference the new treatments have made to the myeloma patients' life, really. I mean, it's amazing that I'm still here. I remember when I was first diagnosed, I just said to the doctor, all I want to do is see my children through school. And, I've got really great news because I've not only seen them through school, they're both at university now doing these fantastic degrees. My son's doing a master's in sports science, and my daughter's doing this incredible degree in Cornwall, marine and natural history photography. It's something that I've been so privileged to see. I can't tell you how great that is. Anyway,
Rosie, that's amazing to hear. Absolutely, and I can see the delight shine through on your face. I'm also so pleased you've got some of the home team in tonight supporting you on this. So one of the things I wanted to ask you was, can you tell us a little bit about your experience of how you got involved with Myeloma UK and how you got involved with health technology assessments?
Well, I got involved with Myeloma UK. I saw the advert for the advocacy partner panel, and I thought, you know what, my background and experience is kind of just right for this. So I had to apply. I mean, I worked for 26 years in the Children's Social Services Department. I'm a qualified social worker. But the last part of my career, I moved over into children's commissioning. So I commissioned advocacy services for children. And I know what a difference that advocacy can make. And that's why I put my name forward.
And can you tell us a little bit about what exactly is your role then in the health technology assessments as they go on, as they meet?
Well, this is how I see my role. I'm there to put forward a patient's perspective, which means I'm there simply to talk about my experience of being a myeloma patient, how myeloma affects me, and in particular to talk about the drugs in question. So I've only been to health technology assessments that involve drugs that I've experienced. I think that's what Myeloma UK tries to do, to ensure that the people who are coming can talk about the side effects of those drugs and, how well tolerated they have been. And so most of my experience has been talking about daratumumab. And that's a drug that worked really well for me. So it's really good to go in there and explain what a difference it makes. And I know I'm just one person, and everybody experiences treatments differently. And what is great is that it's not just me there in these meetings. Myeloma UK are always there, and they pull together a broader patient perspective. So I talk about my experience, but Myeloma UK put together these amazing reports that they've gathered from years of experience to really get across what it's like living with myeloma and to advocate.
But nonetheless, Rosie, it's a huge contribution that you're making to this. And, you know, these are big meetings, let's be honest, and you're having to dig quite deep into your own personal experience. How did you prepare yourself to do this? And then how do you feel about it when you get out of the other end?
Oh, those are good questions. Do you know, the first health technology assessment, the committee meeting that I went to, Myeloma UK and the patient involvement team at NICE was so good at preparing me for the meeting that I went in feeling really confident, actually. I have to say, though, going into the meetings, the first one in particular, I guess I was a little bit overwhelmed by some of the science and some of the statistics and the statistical modelling. And there was also a whole load of new acronyms to get my head around. So, however, I have to say, it's become easier the more meetings I've been to. I think I've been to at least 6 now. And if anyone's thinking of signing up to do this, the thing is, what I've learned is actually you don't have to understand everything about the science to make a really valuable contribution. You're there to talk about your experience as a patient and your experience of taking the drugs that are under discussion. So therefore, you know, really, there's no one else in the room that's had that experience. So you are the expert. So yeah.
And so many people say that, and it's one of the things I know Sheila and Scott always say as well. You are the expert at your own experience. It's all about bringing together everybody who can put their own line of expertise into the process.
Yeah.
Right at the top, when we started talking, you talked about how a couple of the treatments that you were taking had been recently approved.
Yeah.
And you saw almost a bit of a serendipity in that. I mean, in terms of the impact you hope to get out of these meetings, is it important to you that patients have their voices heard?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's absolutely important. I mean, if you're talking about the impact of patient voice, I guess it's difficult for me as a patient, not being the decision maker, to really pinpoint what difference my contributions have made. I guess that's for decision makers to tell us. I'd be interested to hear a bit more about that. But that said, you know, I've worn the shoe on the other foot, as they say. I've had my own professional experience as a former commissioner in children's services. So of advocacy services. I've had a lot of experience of involving children and young people in the decisions, not only about their personal lives, but complicated decisions like which services we should commission and which staff we should employ. So I've had children and young people working in interviews with me. And their participation really does make a difference, and not just on the individual decisions. I think this is the important thing. It makes a difference to the whole culture of the organisation. And the more you get young people involved, what I noticed is the more that people valued and understood the contribution they could make. So if you're following me, what I hope is that this is the same for patient involvement. The more we get patients involved, the more it'll change the culture, and the more professionals will be able to understand and value the contribution that we can make. Does that make sense?
Absolutely makes sense. And it's an extraordinary and very powerful way of describing it, and actually an incredibly hopeful message to give to the whole community when we're looking at getting new treatments and better treatments into clinics all the time. So building on that hope a little bit, and your expertise now, because you have been to multiple meetings, And I also understand you have quite the track record of success. What are your hopes for the future?
Well, this is really interesting because I think Scott might have stolen my thunder a bit, because a lot of things he was saying really resonate with me. So I've got some things written down here. And the first thing I've got is I'd like to see more flexibility in the treatment pathway so that patients don't miss out on, in particular, new drugs that are coming in and existing drugs. Just because they progress too far down the pathway, they might be at fourth or fifth line. I don't think people should miss out. So I'm not really convinced that having a rigid pathway works brilliantly for myeloma patients. You know, I'm particularly concerned about what happens post fifth line, really. Once you've gone through all your standard lines of treatment, Scott was touching on this, we definitely need new options, treatments that work differently. Because I've seen people reach this point, people who are still really fit and well. And if they can access the right treatment, they carry on living really good lives, good quality of lives. But to access those treatments after the standard care, it requires quite a lot of, I don't know what the word is, tenacity, really. You have to be fairly determined. And it's been upsetting for me to see people that I know searching for trials and other treatments at this stage, which could extend their lives. I've seen people having to travel miles to access treatments at this point, and not all people can do this. It's not, I don't think it's really fair. I don't know what the solution is. It's just an observation, really. And the other thing that I've got written down here is that, again, Scott touched on this, it would be great if we could understand more about what treatments work well for individual people, because we all know people respond so differently to different treatments at different stages. To untangle some of that and be able to provide a more personalised care would be great. I mean, I'm a case in point here. I finally reached a point where my paraproteins are undetectable. That's after 12 years. I haven't been in this position, but we finally found something that seems to work quite well. I'm not saying other treatments didn't. I've been, what would I describe myself as, kind of rather disappointingly average, really, in my response. So I'm hoping for something better this time. Yeah.
Rosie, I think a lot of your hopes and your aspirations will be echoed widely throughout the myeloma community. And for now, can I just thank you so much for the candor and the power and the passion you have brought to talking to us about the work you do on health technology assessments. We'll say a brief goodbye now, but we'll see you back again for the Q&A session later.
Bye.
Thank you, Rosie. Thank you. Following that, can he follow that? I'm sure he can. I am absolutely delighted. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Neil Rabin. Neil may be familiar to some of you. He is the consultant haematologist at University College London Hospital, and he is also chair of the UK Myeloma Society. And Neil has worked for a long time with Myeloma UK to provide the evidence needed for several HTAs, and appears as a clinical expert at these meetings. Thank you so much for joining, Neil. And we were talking about UKMS. I think you've come hot foot from one of their meetings.
I have just got our meeting, yes.
Oh, well, thank you. Look, let's kick off. Can you tell us in a bit more detail about how you've worked with Myeloma UK in getting patients access to new treatments?
So firstly to say, I think Rosie is such a powerful voice and an advocate on behalf of myeloma patients. So it's really quite inspiring, I've got to be honest. I think we're very fortunate that there are new treatments now for myeloma. That's an amazing advancements in the treatments that we have. We, in the clinical community, so I'm chair of the UK Myeloma Society, work alongside Myeloma UK to advocate on behalf of patients in the clinical community, really, to get the best treatments for our patients. And I think obviously NICE works within a framework, but I've got to say that Myeloma UK has been an amazing advocate for patients. You've been doing this for many years. You clearly have institutional memory as to how the process works. I think that's really important. I think it's really important that we work collaboratively together. So both the clinicians, the patient voice, pharmaceutical industry, and you've been an amazing and very positive influence in the appraisals.
Neil, that's incredibly kind, but we all do this work so that we can bring the chance of change into clinics for patients at the end of the day. What impact have you observed the Myeloma UK advocacy work having on the patients that you see?
I mean, we're fortunate that there's a positive appraisal literally within the last few weeks that we're able to access new treatments. So the reality is that we know that there are lots of new treatments for myeloma. What we need to ensure is that the health technology appraisal, which we've discussed and Scott has discussed, is available for patients. So I think what Myeloma UK has done is that they have promoted the patient voice. And I think it's a very powerful voice in committee, actually, because although we have to look at the evidence, we have to deal with uncertainty, which Scott has alluded to, I think the patient voice is a very powerful voice. And actually, I'm sure does make the difference. I think Rosie may not be aware of whether it does make the difference. Looking at the committee chair and things, I think it absolutely does make the difference.
I wholeheartedly agree, Neil. And Scott did a bit of this in his presentation. So if you don't mind, I'm going to ask you to as well. A bit of future casting. What are your hopes for the future?
So I think we're very fortunate that there are lots of new treatments. So I think the treatments that we know are have got very good trial data, and we're hoping will be available for patients in the near future, will be the new immune therapies. So T-cell engagers and CAR-T and other BCMA targeted therapies. And I think that they are currently going through the NICE appraisal process, and we're going to clearly advocate on behalf of patients. I think the other issue is that the appraisal process historically has been quite rigid in what it sees as number of lines of treatment. And actually the treatment pathway has evolved, which is great, but it also means that dealing with X number of lines of treatment isn't really probably what's appropriate now. And I think we need to try and engage with our HTA partners to think about other ways of appraising patients or new treatments for patients. So I think in summary, I think it's the concept that we're moving away from your conventional chemotherapy regimens to the new immune therapies, and I would hope that those are going to be available in the very near future for our patients.
This theme of rigidity in the process keeps coming up again and again, Neil. What are the benefits that patients would see if a less rigid approach to drug approval was taken?
So I think the historic process was when there was a limited number of treatments available for patients, then when you were talking about number of lines of treatment was probably more relevant. So what would you receive as first line, second line, or third line? What we're seeing now is we're talking about lots of combination treatments, so either triplet or quadruplet therapies. So it may be that a lot of patients have received treatments earlier on in their lines of treatment. They would have received them far earlier in their treatment pathway than they would have when NICE was appraising things 5 or 10 years ago. And I would hope that the appraisal process would allow us to look at some of the newer therapies in earlier lines of therapy.
Thank you. And some people on this seminar may not know this about you. And I'm hoping I'm not going to embarrass you here, Neil, but you took part in the London to Paris ride this year. And I think you were our top fundraiser. So first of all, an enormous thank you from the whole myeloma community.
Well, the people who gave money are the people who should be thanked.
The donors, absolutely. And to that point, why do you think it is so important for people to fundraise for things like this advocacy work?
So I think Myeloma UK is an amazing organisation, and I truly mean it, not because I'm here, I'm not paid to say that, I truly believe it from my heart. I think that you do so much for patients in such a holistic way. So we're talking about advocacy and new treatments, which is really important. The fact that Myeloma UK provides support for patients, the info line, the info days that you provide, this webinar that we're doing now, support not only for patients and also for family. There are so many aspects, and obviously research as well, and supporting research is another thing. But I think it's really important that we have strong advocates from the clinical community and the patient community, so that we can collectively, with one voice, and it has to be with one voice, make sure that we get the best treatment for our patients. And that's why I think we need to support Myeloma UK.
Thank you, Neil. That's an incredibly powerful thought to leave us with. Now, I'm hoping you're going to stay around because I'm very conscious of the time, and I'm going to ask Scott and Rosie if they would please come back into the space so that we can kick off our question and answer session. We may, because we have so many questions, go a little bit over 6 o'clock. So for those of you joining us, if you have to leave, please don't worry about jumping off the call. You'll get a recording, as we say, of the whole event later on, so you'll be able to catch up on any bits that you've missed. So let's start with a question from Mark. Does the relative rarity of myeloma compared to other cancers significantly affect the chances of new treatments getting NICE approval? And Neil, I wonder if you would take that one.
So I don't think that the rarity of myeloma impacts on the ability to receive new treatments. I think that you need to have a NICE require standard of care versus the new therapy for there to be a randomized trial between those. And so long as you have sufficient numbers in both groups, and then you have outcomes looking at survival, and that has been in all the appraisals that I've looked at, that hasn't impacted on the ability of getting new treatments. But the thing that in a way potentially is problematic is the length of follow-up, and obviously dealing with uncertainty is something that NICE has to deal with. But I don't think because it's a relatively rare cancer that prevents new treatments being made available.
Thank you, Neil. That's very helpful. This next question is from Terry. And Scott, I'm going to direct this one to you, if I may. Why does NICE take so long approving new treatment when clinical trials show them to be successful?
I think that's partly explained by the two different aspects. The clinical trials will show safety and efficacy of the drug, and that's where you get your marketing license from MHRA from. But NICE has got a different job. It's looking at the cost effectiveness, and it's quite a clunky way of saying it's looking at how does this new drug compare to the standard of care, as Neil has alluded to, and you get into quite a lot of modelling and assumptions and data. And so the NICE process itself, in the context of clinical trials, is not that long. It can be 12 months or shorter, but it's an additional barrier, another hurdle to NHS making the drug available. And then there are some added complexities around NHS in terms of whether they can afford the drug that NICE says cost effective. So it's another barrier that most countries have adopted, this health technology piece.
Rosie, I could see you nodding when we talked about the length of time a drug takes to get approval. That clearly resonated with you.
Well, yeah, it is obviously really hard for people to understand when they've not been involved in the process as to why it takes so long. I mean, I think I've been quite privileged to be involved in the process and get that kind of insider view, and I think I have a better understanding now of what goes into bringing a drug to the NHS. It's complicated, it's time consuming, and it's a very thorough process. And as a patient, it's really frustrating. You know, you hear these new drugs are around in the system, and then, it's kind of, it's just frustrating and confusing as to why there are these effective drugs, yet they still don't seem to be anywhere on the horizon. So it does resonate.
So I think we're going to stick with this. Yeah, exactly. Speed it up. I think we're going to stick with this theme of obstacles for a moment. And this is a question from Malcolm. And Neil, I wonder if you would take this one. What are the 3 most significant obstacles to making headway with new drug introduction?
Wow. Okay. So I think the first one is, I think for NICE, that the big issue is one of uncertainty. So I think that it's great that there's new drugs available, but the pharmaceutical industry always puts a very positive spin on new drugs, which is, good. But sometimes the small print isn't always made available, and that's something that's really important. There's no doubt that there are financial concerns, that it's essentially a political construct. So in a way, you can't get away from the fact that there are kind of financial issues. And I can't think of a third off the top of my head.
Well, this may help because there's a follow-up, a linked question to this coming from Barry and Bridget. Well, what happens when an appeal to NICE or SMC fails? Does, for example, the Cancer Drug Fund continue to fund the treatment, or does it withdraw it? And if it is withdrawn, then what happens to patients who are on that drug treatment? And Neil, if I can go to you first, but Scott, please do come in afterwards with your observations.
So I think the first thing to say is that if somebody is receiving a drug on the Cancer Drug Fund, irrespective of whether that drug is not made available and goes to what's called baseline commissioning, their drug is never withdrawn. So whatever treatment they've started will always continue. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that clearly it's always possible that a drug is temporarily approved on the Cancer Drug Fund, dealing with the uncertainty issue. So maybe there's more data that would need to be collected. I think that we've been very fortunate that since I've been doing this in the last 5 or 10 years, all of the Cancer Drug Fund applications have been positively looked at. Sometimes there's a bit of jiggery-pokery going on behind the scenes that people may not always be aware of, but actually I think the chances of a drug being on the CDF and not approved is very unlikely to happen. I don't know, Scott, if you want to say anything about that.
Yeah, I think you covered that well, Neil. I think when you're looking at clinical trials, the pharmaceutical companies always have a commitment to maintaining the supply of that drug, almost irrespective of whether it's approved or not at the NICE end of things. I think the unfortunate piece is if the decision is no and it doesn't go through managed access into the Cancer Drugs Fund, that drug is not available for new patients. And then we get into the very difficult situation that sometimes that drug is available in the private sector only, or it's available in another country, in Europe or North America. And that's why it comes back to why we drive so hard to make sure that the drug's available either through managed access, through the Cancer Drugs Fund, or routinely commissioned, as Neil has said.
So Scott, if I can keep you on that theme of disparity of access, Jackie has asked a question. How does Myeloma UK deal with the situation where different devolved agencies give different approvals for the same drug? How are Myeloma UK working to ensure equality over the UK?
That's a tough question. I mean, we have seen recent examples of where the drug was approved quicker in Scotland or not approved in England. And really, this comes down to some of these almost, dare I say, cultural aspects. And I don't mean Scotland and England. I mean the assessment piece, where some HTA agencies will accept a bit more uncertainty in data where others have a lot more scrutiny, and that's where you get this disconnect sometimes, that you'll get an SMC approval and maybe perhaps not one at NICE. But our role then is, as you've seen this year, we've challenged twice NICE decisions not to routinely commission and not to go for managed access, and that's where the power of our experience and our community comes in, where it's not lost on me that as a patient organisation, we appeal a legislative process and we're successful. That shows you how much our voice is heard. And so, yeah, we continue to engage, and fortunately, every time we've been successful up to date.
So again, with this idea of that advocacy to ensure access being such a crucial part of the process, we've received several questions about CAR T treatments. Rachel, Tim, Valerie, and other people have been in touch, and they want to know, when can they get access to CAR T treatment? And is Myeloma UK advocating for access to it? So Scott, I'm going to kick that one off with you, but Neil, please do come in afterwards.
Yeah, so we're in constant contact with the manufacturers of the CAR T drugs. We're also in contact with NHS around capacity, so making sure that the CAR T systems are in place to be able to deliver them, normally through centres of excellence. The issue around CAR T comes back to price, and it comes back to them able to go through the cost effectiveness criteria that NICE put in place. So these drugs are expensive, but they're phenomenally good in terms of efficacy and safety. So we continually engage with industry, with the pharmaceutical companies, and we're looking for some more positive news in the next couple of years. To be fair to the pharmaceutical companies, they have cited manufacturing issues. These are complex drugs to make. However, they are available in other countries, and that's where we get this health inequality. Why are they available in Germany and not the UK? So that's high in our list of activity at the minute, to push to make sure that these drugs are submitted to NICE and SMC and try and get them as quickly as possible to patients on the NHS.
Neil, would you add anything?
I think I agree with what Scott has said. I think that we definitely are advocating. I think supply issues have been one issue which probably isn't publicly known. Whether that's a commercial decision or not, it means that if they're not able to supply the drug, that means that they're not going to then go through with the current appraisal. And we are definitely doing our best to get access to CAR T. There are clinical trials. I appreciate limited numbers. And actually, I would say that probably the thing that's likely to come sooner would be your what are called T-cell engagers. Mm-hmm. So teclistamab or elranatamab. There are others that are definitely going through the NICE appraisal process, and hopefully will be available, we would hope, next year, all being well.
Staying with pipeline treatments and staying in the space of future casting, Nick asks, what new treatments are in the pipeline beyond the use of monoclonal antibodies, either alone or in combination with other drugs? I don't know, Neil, do you want to kick us off on that one, and Scott can come in afterwards?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a whole raft of treatments that are being looked at. So if we go away from the immune therapies like CAR T, bio trispecifics, we can talk about selective inhibitors, exportin 1 inhibitors. We can talk about the new super IMiDs. That's a description that we would use. The concept of maybe targeted therapies for subgroups of patients. So maybe RAS or RAF inhibitors, or maybe we could talk about patients who might access venetoclax or other things. So there are definitely more treatments than purely talking about the immune therapies.
Scott, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I think just in conjunction to that, it's the ability for these new treatments to come through to be used on almost we'd call it personalized medicines approach, so individual risk basis, so ultra and high risk myeloma, and that we're seeing that now. And we're actually, Myeloma UK is funding those types of trials. So in combination with new drug targets, and using them in a bespoke case-by-case basis is really what looks, incredibly optimistic coming, fairly soon.
Thank you. We are going to run a bit over, so this is going to be the last question. If we haven't got to your question, I am so sorry, but there are lots of ways you can get in touch with us to ask it, and they'll be in the follow-up email. So our last question is from Jackie. What is being done to provide patients who have had more than 5 lines of treatment, but who are still fit and healthy, with other treatment options, aside from going on clinical trials, which are often not geographically practical? And Scott, can I put that one to you first, and Neil, please do jump in afterwards.
Yeah, I think if you look at that number of HTAs ongoing at the minute, they're looking at 4th, 5th line and beyond. So that is a big development over the last couple of years, and hopefully we'll see those molecules being available, or drugs, sorry, being available very soon. So it is pretty much dependent on what's coming through. But again, if you look at the clinical trial finder and the drug tracker, you'll see, as Neil said as well, these new targets coming through that hopefully, are critically needed for those patients that have got advanced disease and have been through several cycles.
I think outside of clinical trials, for people who have gone through what we would consider conventional treatments, the alternative route would be compassionate use, and that doesn't necessarily mean that you'd need to go to a large centre to receive that. Compassionate use programs essentially mean that the pharmaceutical industry allows your clinician to access drugs that haven't or are in the process of going through HTA approval. Some of them are prior to licensing, some of them are after licensing, and that is the hope for that is that it would fill the gap between patients who, for geographical reasons, may not necessarily be able to go on to clinical trials and may have gone through the conventional treatments. So compassionate use programs.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you to all the people who we have spoken to today, and the Q&A panel, Neil, Scott and Rosie, and particular thanks, Rosie, because you have been beavering away answering questions in the Q&A box about your experience, which I know has helped an awful lot of people. We could continue to talk about this, I think, easily for another hour. So maybe we'll have to do another follow-up event at some point. I'm penciling you all in already. But for now, thank you very, very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So to all of you who are still with us, I hope this event has helped to explain the role Myeloma UK plays in channeling the patient voice and getting critical new treatments approved on the NHS. Those of you who know Myeloma UK know that patients are at the heart of everything we do, and we really don't take no for an answer when it comes to getting access to new treatments, and Scott's talked a lot about that this evening. But most importantly, none of the crucial work that you've heard about tonight would be possible without all the volunteers, the donors and the fundraisers who support Myeloma UK. And on behalf of the whole myeloma community, I want to say a huge thank you for your support. It truly makes a difference, and it makes work like this achievable. And if you've watched this event and you feel that Myeloma UK's advocacy work has made a difference for you or for a loved one, or you value this work and you would like to make more of it possible, then please do consider supporting Myeloma UK. And as if by magic, there is an easy way to do it. Our Christmas appeal has just launched, and it's called More Christmases Together, because that's what the point of this work is. It's what we're trying to do here to help families affected by myeloma have more time and more Christmases together with their loved ones. And the link to that appeal should be appearing in the chat box now. And if you do feel like donating, please do donate soon, because your gift will be matched at absolutely no cost to you. We will receive twice the money thanks to a group of very generous Myeloma UK supporters who have agreed a match pot up to an amazing £25,000. So if you are able to give, giving early means we get twice the value of your gift. Myeloma UK wants to find a cure for myeloma, but until then, we will continue to work tirelessly to get people affected by myeloma the access to the treatment and care that they so badly need. Thank you so much for your time and for joining us this evening, and have a very good rest of your evening. Goodbye for now.
Bye.